It's long overdue that I talk about one of the most controversial topics among the writing community, and that is head hopping. But what is head hopping, and how does it differ from omniscient narration? And why is it always considered a bad thing to head hop? Today, I'm going to address all of those questions and reveal my perspective on head hopping as a professional book editor. Specifically, why I think head hopping ruins your novel. Over my career, I've worked with hundreds of authors ranging from debut novelists to best-selling authors, and head hopping is one of the most common issues I see. If you're a writer, especially if you're working on a novel, I recommend subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. Every week, I either post videos with craft advice, like today's video, or I talk about the book publishing industry specifically from the traditional side, which is my professional background. So I'd love to have you join this amazing community of more than 25,000 authors. Before we get into the video, it would mean a lot to me if you just give this video a thumbs up. It really does help out my channel. Thank you so much. So first, let's talk definitions. What is head hopping? In short, head hopping occurs when we occupy the interiority or the headspace of multiple characters within the same scene. And typically we're moving between them kind of at random. There's no real pattern to where we are switching between perspectives. We are in one moment in Jill's head, and then the next moment we're in Jack's head, and then we might be in Miles's head, and then maybe we're back to Jill, back to Jack. We're hopping around. Many authors have the misunderstanding that they are writing omniscient narration, but they are actually head hopping instead. So I often see authors cite very well-known classic novels, best-selling novels from years past that were written in a style where we do bop around between different characters' heads and say, well, they're head hopping, so why can't I head hop? But really, that's not the case. They're writing typically an omniscient narration. So with omniscient narration, the narrator is actually a character who has their own voice and commentary on the story. While they do have access to multiple characters' interiorities, we are aware of the narrator's distinct voice and their presence throughout the entire story. So it is very clear to the reader that we are experiencing the story from their bird's eye perspective. Whereas head hopping, we don't have that narrator presence. We're really just bopping around from character to character's head. And it's really just operating like a messy conglomeration of close third-person perspective. Another way to easily tell if you're actually writing omniscient narration or if you're head hopping is if the narrator has access to information that none of the characters know. If that is the case, the narrator is providing their own perspective and commentary in acting in an omniscient way. In the case of head hopping, we are still limited to the perspectives that you are showing at any given moment, and there is nobody to pull us out of what is going on in the characters' heads and show us something that the characters themselves are not aware of. It's quite easy to tell in a work of fiction if it is written from an omniscient perspective or if it's head hopping, because an omniscient narration will feel very intentionally crafted, whereas head hopping will feel a bit chaotic and haphazard. This is really best illustrated with an example, so I've put together a passage that head hops. So feel free to critique it as much as you want, tear it apart. I wrote this very quickly, just for the example's sake. As Amy tucked Brayden into bed, the doorbell rang. She checked the clock on his nightstand, 11 p.m. She had no idea who would come over at this hour. Her heart rate began to pick up. It can't be the police, can it? I'll go see who that is, honey, Amy said, trying to contain the quiver in her voice. Okay, Mom, Brayden replied. He knew who was at the door. His father had told him earlier that day that he'd come over sometime that night to pick up his suit. As Amy approached the door, she considered grabbing the baseball bat she kept in the coat closet. So here, we begin the first paragraph deeply in Amy's POV. I say deeply because we even get a line of her exact dialogue that goes through her head when she says, "It can't be the police, can it?" This gives us the perspective that this entire scene is going to be told from Amy's perspective. But then in the second paragraph, we switch to Brayden's POV with the line, "He knew who was at the door." That is information that Amy is not privy to, so we are now dipping into Brayden's head. And then we hop back out of it when we jump back to Amy approaching the door and wondering if she should grab the baseball bat. In this example, there is no sense of an omniscient narrator who is providing commentary or who has access to information that Amy or Braden don't, so it's not operating as omniscient narration. This would be head hopping. Now that we know what head hopping is, I want to talk about the reasons that it ruins your novel. But before I do so, I want to direct you to a free resource I have in the description. It is called my Story Self-Assessment Worksheet. And if you have a current draft of your book, it's a fun, easy way to identify areas that are really strong and areas where you could improve on the next draft. Downloading that is also going to sign you up for my newsletter, where I publish exclusive interviews with publishing industry insiders and successfully published authors. And you all are giving me some amazing feedback on the newsletter. I'm so glad you're enjoying it. And if you haven't checked it out, please go ahead and do so. If you want to go straight to the newsletter, the link is in the description. So why is head hopping bad? Why does it ruin your novel? The first reason is that it prevents deep character connections. When considering what POVs you are going to include in your story or not, the question really boils down to, whose story is this? Who does the story belong to? The POV ultimately is what determines which characters the reader is going to be invested in, because we're naturally going to feel most closely connected to your POV characters. The issue with head hopping is that you are often scattering the story across many perspectives. I've edited novels where we have 11, 12 different POVs in one single story. And typically in those cases, we're never spending enough time with certain POVs to fully get invested in them, and thereby you are preventing us from having deep character connections with each of them. A novel that, on the flip side, rotates between 3 or 4 POVs on a consistent basis is likely going to feel much more engaging than one that hops between a dozen perspectives, because we're going to feel so much more immersed and invested in those characters that the story truly belongs to. So when I'm working with clients who are head hopping in their current draft, I often will recommend that they reconceptualize the POV as a rotating close third-person perspective, rather than omniscient or head hopping. In these cases, I will encourage them to choose maybe 3 to 5 distinct POVs that the entire novel will be contained to. That way, we will see the story from multiple different angles, but at the same time, we'll still spend enough time with each POV to develop that character's full arc and to make the reader feel totally engaged with those characters. For example, a novel that does a high number of POVs really well is The Guest List by Lucy Foley. We rotate between 5 different character POVs, but it never veers into head hopping territory because it is very clear when we are in each POV and we feel deeply connected to each of those 5 characters. The next reason why head hopping can ruin your novel is that it disrupts the narrative flow. With head hopping, such as in the example that I just showed, just as we're getting immersed in one character's POV and we're feeling like we're seeing things from their perspective and we're fully inhabiting their experience, we suddenly and abruptly switch to a different character. This disrupts the flow of the scene and makes it much more difficult for you as the author to execute a smooth crescendo of suspense. It also eventually becomes impossible for the reader to predict whose POV we will be following at any given moment because the narrative is throwing different POVs at us constantly. Oftentimes, this leads to narrative imbalance, in which we end up spending disproportionate amounts of time with certain POVs over others. Maybe we only see one character's POV for a couple lines or one scene, and then that is going to feel like an outlier because we never return to that POV. I'm not saying it's impossible for you to have a scene or a chapter where you include a POV that you don't include elsewhere. That is especially popular for prologues or epilogue type parts of the story. But if you're just throwing a POV in there in the middle of the story and we never pick it back up, that could be confusing to the reader. Overall, head hopping just tends to feel a bit chaotic and messy because there's no rhyme or reason to when we are moving between POVs. Typically, the POV switches do not happen at chapter breaks or scene breaks, they happen mid-scene or mid-chapter. The final reason why head hopping ruins your novel is that it erodes your reader's trust. This is arguably the most important reason why head hopping is not typically advised. If the reader has no sense of who the story truly belongs to and is confused by being jostled around between all these POVs at random, eventually they could lose their trust in your authority as a storyteller. Remember that your goal as the author is to deliver a smooth, effortless, engaging, exciting reading experience where the reader just can't help but turn the pages compulsively. That feeling is unlike anything else. That's what you're trying to achieve. But head hopping makes it very difficult to get there because the reader never feels secure or grounded or fully oriented in the narrative. It's going to be much more difficult for us to get immersed in the novel's world. Now, head hopping is one of the most common amateur writing mistakes, so do not feel bad if you notice this in your story. It is absolutely something that you can change and fix. It's something I've worked with many authors on. When you look at the majority of novels that are published by Big 5 publishing houses today, they typically will either be in first person, in close third person, or in rotating close third person, where we are limited to a set number of POVs and we switch between them very consistently. So if you're unsure what POV to use for your novel, I would default to one of those and ensure that you're not head hopping. I hope this video helped you understand what head hopping really is and how it can weaken your story. Let me know in the comments if you've ever run into this issue of head hopping. I know it's something that we talk about a lot, so let me know what you've heard and what you think. If you've decided to adopt close third person as your narrative perspective, check out my video on common mistakes in close third person POV. You'll definitely want to check your manuscript against those. Before you head out, please hit that thumbs up button. It really helps out my channel. Hit that subscribe button to join this amazing community. And don't forget your free story self-assessment worksheet and my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.